On that grey morning, the air was heavy, not just from the fine rain that stubbornly fell over Pedra Branca, but from a thick silence that had settled in Silas's house. The smell of wet earth drifted through the half-open windows, a familiar scent that once brought peace, but now seemed to carry a lament. Silas, in his early 70s, felt his wife's absence more keenly than ever, a void that no memory could fill. He watched the neighbors' children playing in the street, their laughter echoing like distant memories of a time when his own home was full of life. Now, only coldness remained. His daughter Elisa and son-in-law Marcos lived there, but their presence was more a burden than a comfort. Silas heard from his rocking chair on the porch whispers that grew increasingly indiscreet. "He's got nothing left," Elisa would say, the phrase cutting deeper than any blade, while Marcos, with his soft voice but sharp intentions, wove plans about the house. With each raindrop that hit the roof, Silas felt time slipping away, taking with it not just his youth but his very dignity. And that's why today I invite you watching now to leave your name and the city you're watching from in the comments. Your voice makes all the difference to our community. Silas was a man of few words. A silent pride kept him from exposing his pain. He had learned the bitter lesson that others' kindness almost always came with a price. That's why he preferred isolation, resigning himself to silence, even if it pushed him further away. He wanted to be seen, to be valued, not as a nuisance, but as the pillar he had always been for his family. He wanted to protect the legacy he and his beloved had built, a legacy that went far beyond the modest walls of that house. But Elisa and Marcos saw no legacy, only an underutilized asset, valuable land in the heart of the village, an expense to be eliminated from the accounting of their ambitious lives. One afternoon, Silas was sitting in the kitchen, drinking his freshly brewed coffee, when Marcos, with a smile too wide to be sincere, accidentally dropped a local real estate brochure on the table. The cover featured a generic photo of a renovated house, but Silas wasn't foolish. His keen eyes noticed the corner of a folded page, briefly revealing a miniature of his own house with a handwritten note. "Great location, appreciation potential." Marcos quickly picked up the brochure, almost trying to hide it, but the damage was done. That fleeting, calculated image was like a seed of distrust planted in Silas's heart. He felt a shiver. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but each time the evidence became clearer, colder. In the days that followed, the house seemed to shrink for Silas. Every corner, every object, once sources of memory and comfort, now seemed observed, evaluated. Elisa began to question his electricity and water bills, always with a tone of concern that hid judgment. "Dad, you don't need so much light at night, do you? And that faucet dripping wastes too much," she'd say, while Marcos nodded in agreement, a distant look in his eyes. Silas felt the emotional cost, the feeling of being an intruder in his own home, his refuge turning into a prison. He wondered if there would be a limit to their coldness, how far they would go to get what they wanted. One morning, as Silas watered his plants in the backyard, he saw Elisa and Marcos rummaging through an old drawer in the living room where he kept important papers. They didn't know he was there. Elisa held a brown envelope, the same one that held the house deed. "Look here, Marcos, what I found. It's all still in Dad's name. We need to sort this out soon," she whispered, her voice filled with an urgency Silas had never heard from her regarding his well-being. Marcos took the document, his fingers tracing the paper as if already touching a distant future far from Silas. The old man's heart tightened. They were making a move. What would they do with that document? What could Silas do to protect what was his, without his pride preventing him from fighting? Silas's heart beat a dull rhythm, echoing the rain outside. The image of the deed in Elisa and Marcos's hands wouldn't leave his mind. It was as if each day, an invisible piece of his life was being torn away. He felt the house, once a sanctuary of memories, now transforming into a stage for a silent game, where his daughter and son-in-law's laughter sounded like the soundtrack to a premature farewell. What else were they meddling with? What else were they planning without his knowledge? He began to observe every movement, every whisper. Conversations about the future of the house became more frequent, more explicit. "Dad, what do you think about us modernizing it here?" Elisa asked one day, with a twinkle in her eyes that wasn't affection but calculation. "After all, the house is getting old. It needs a touch-up." That way, it'll be more comfortable for you, don't you think? Marcos, always the perfect complement, agreed, talking about the land's potential, the necessary improvements. Silas saw through the polished words to the real intention. It wasn't about comfort, it was about value, about the sale that was approaching, step by step. The pressure increased, subtle but constant. The refrigerator, once always full, began to have its items counted. Lights were turned off more frequently under the pretext of saving money. Silas felt the weight of being a burden, an expense. His pride, however, prevented him from confronting them. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. He clung to his dignity, even if inside the pain was a tight knot. But what to do when his own family seemed determined to push him out of his own home? One afternoon, Elisa came home with a man in a suit, a Dr. Roberto, whom she introduced as a friend who understands renovations and appraisals. The man walked through all the rooms, measuring walls, taking photos with his phone. "It's just to get an idea of what needs to be done, Dad," Elisa justified, with a forced smile, "so you can have more comfort." Silas, sitting in his rocking chair in the living room, watched. His keen eyes noticed that Dr. Roberto wasn't just evaluating renovation needs. He looked at the structure, the location, the land's potential, with a gaze Silas recognized from afar, the gaze of a negotiator. He heard the man murmur to Elisa about market possibilities, and a shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't a renovation estimate, it was a disguised appraisal for sale. Dr. Roberto left a brown envelope for Elisa, with a discreet logo of a real estate consultancy. This was the third piece of evidence, a clear part of their plan. Silas picked up the envelope left carelessly on the table. Inside, there was a preliminary report. It didn't talk about tiles or paint, but about market value, constructive potential, and lot subdivision viability. It was signed by this Dr. Roberto. It was the missing proof, the hammer striking the truth he already felt in his soul. Kindness, as he well knew, always came with a price, and the price now was his home, his legacy. Have you ever felt invisible to someone who should love you? Have you ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet when the painful truth is revealed? This story of Silas is a mirror for many of us. It's about the struggle for dignity, for justice that seems never to arrive. If you identify with this search for clarity and what is just, I invite you to join our community. Leave a comment with the hashtag #SilentLegacy and say what this story makes you feel. Your voice is our strength, and together we can uncover hidden truths. The discovery of the report lit a flame in Silas. He could no longer remain silent. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a declaration of war. He needed a plan, something his pride wouldn't let him expose, but his life's wisdom compelled him to prepare. He remembered a small metal safe, hidden in a secret place, which he and his late wife had concealed years ago, containing important documents, a kind of plan B for the future. But how to access it without raising suspicion? And what, in fact, was inside that could change the game? Silas, his mind racing, knew he had to act. Pride, once a barrier, now mingled with cold determination. He couldn't confront them directly, not yet. But he remembered the safe perfectly. It wasn't a secret to his wife, Maria, who helped him hide it years ago, during the uncertain times of inflation and empty political promises. The safe was behind a false wall in the old sewing room, a little used room that Elisa and Marcos had turned into a storage dump. He waited. Days dragged on, each a silent torture. Elisa and Marcos, feeling victorious with the appraisal report, redoubled their insinuations. "Dad, have you thought about going to live with Aunt Celia in Morelia? It's quieter there, and she always liked you a lot," Elisa suggested, with a forced sweetness that didn't fool Silas. Marcos, in turn, began bringing home catalogues of nursing homes. "Just so you know the options, Dad, for your comfort and safety." Each word was a jab, a cruel reminder that they saw him as a nuisance with a valuable house. With each suggestion, Silas felt the wound deepen, but also his determination solidify. He needed time, a moment when the house was empty, without the curious eyes of his daughter and son-in-law. That moment came on a Tuesday, when Elisa and Marcos left to deal with urgent matters in the neighboring city, promising to return only at night. Silas felt a relief mixed with tension. It was his chance. With slow but firm steps, he went to the old sewing room. The smell of mold and dust filled the air, mixed with the sweet scent of mangoes coming from outside. The room was crammed with old boxes, dusty furniture, and forgotten objects. He began to move the boxes one by one, feeling the pain in his back but ignoring it. Every movement was an act of resistance. He remembered the exact spot, the texture of the wall, how the false wood fit perfectly. Finally, after almost an hour of effort, he found the place. A small loose piece of wood disguised by old paint. With the tip of an old kitchen knife, he managed to loosen the board, revealing a dark hole in the wall. Inside, wrapped in a faded velvet cloth, was the small metal safe, heavy and cold to the touch. His heart pounded. It was like opening a time capsule, a link to his Maria and the past they built together. With trembling hands, Silas opened the safe. Inside, there were no piles of money, no glittering jewels. There was a stack of documents. The first was a will, dated more than 20 years ago, signed by him and Maria. In it, the house in Pedra Branca was bequeathed to a local charity foundation on the condition that Silas could live in it until the end of his days, and that the foundation would be responsible for his well-being. But there was something else, something that made Silas's blood run cold and at the same time ignited a new hope. Along with the will, there was a deed to a plot of land, a considerable lot, much larger than the houses, located on the outskirts of the city, a place that at the time was desolate and undervalued. But Silas remembered well. Maria always had a vision for that land. They bought it with their life savings, dreaming of building a small community orchard there, a place for Pedra Branca's children to play and learn. The document was impeccable, signed and registered. And then, a third document, more recent, dated just 5 years prior. It was a promise to purchase and sell agreement. The City Hall of Pedra Branca, in an urban expansion plan, had promised to buy that land from Silas and Maria for the construction of a new municipal school and a health center. The value of the promise of sale was surprisingly high, much more than the house where he lived was worth. There was also a confidentiality clause explaining why the negotiation never became public. The agreement was stalled, awaiting federal funding approval, but it was a valid contract with heavy penalties for withdrawal. Silas reread the contract, his eyes scanning each line. That land, once Maria's gamble, was now a gold mine. And Elisa and Marcos, with all their ambition and plans for the house, had no idea of that treasure's existence. What would they say? What would they do when they found out that the old man who had nothing left was, in fact, the owner of a future much more promising than they could ever imagine? The feeling of a piece is missing dissipated, but in its place a new and complex question arose. How to use this information? How to turn the tables without completely destroying what was left of his family? And what would be the true cost of this truth? He put the documents back in the safe, feeling the weight of responsibility and strategy. This was the fourth piece of evidence, the trump card he needed. But the battle was far from over. He knew Elisa and Marcos wouldn't give up easily. The question now was one of time, and how he would reveal this truth fairly and without giving them a chance to retaliate. The silence that once isolated him was now his sharpest weapon. What would come next, then, would be a game of patience and strategy, where every move would count. Silas now held the truth, a heavy secret that burned within him. He spent sleepless nights, reviewing the documents, the will, the deed to the land on the outskirts, the contract with the city hall. With each reading, a wave of relief and another of anguish washed over him. Relief for having the proof, for not being the old man who had nothing left, and anguish for having to use it against his own daughter. It was a dilemma that gnawed at his soul, a tight knot between justice and family love, a love that now seemed so one-sided. Elisa and Marcos, oblivious to the time bomb Silas held, intensified their maneuvers. Conversations about the house's future became more insistent. "Dad, what do you think about us moving to a smaller house? More practical without so many stairs," Elisa suggested one day, flipping through a catalogue of small apartments with the air of someone who had already made up her mind. Marcos, with his soft, persuasive voice, added, "You deserve a more modern place, Dad. Less maintenance. We can help you find one." The words were a slow poison, disguised as care. eroding Silas's autonomy, trying to convince him that he wasn't capable of taking care of himself, that the move was for his own good. Silas, however, maintained his facade of a tired old man, observing in silence. Each suggestion was another brick in the wall they built around him. He saw the gleam in Marcos's eyes when talking about the area's construction potential, already imagining the house demolished, giving way to something new and profitable. The cruelty of the situation was almost palpable, and Silas wondered if they truly believed their own lies, or if greed had completely blinded their affection. The pressure wasn't limited to words. Marcos began bringing home quotes from moving companies. "Just so you have an idea, Dad, if you decide to move in with Aunt Celia." He spoke about bureaucracy, deadlines, as if the move was inevitable, a foregone conclusion. Silas, sitting on the porch, watched his son-in-law walking around the yard, measuring, evaluating, already mentally dividing the land. The scent of mangoes, once a comfort, now seemed to have a bitter tone, a premonition of loss. One night, Silas overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. Elisa and Marcos were in the kitchen, the door ajar. "He won't accept, Marcos. He's too stubborn," Elisa said, her voice low but filled with frustration. "We'll have to force his hand. Dr. Roberto already said that, with the appraisal report, we can argue that the house doesn't offer ideal conditions for an elderly person, and given his age, his decision-making capacity can be questioned," Marcos replied, in an even more calculating tone. "It's a risk, Elisa, but we need to act. This land is worth gold, and we can't let him ruin everything with his cheap sentimentality." The mention of questioning his decision-making capacity hit Silas like lightning. It was no longer just about the house, it was about his mind, his autonomy, his very existence. They were willing to do anything, even take away his voice. The emotional cost was immense. Silas felt cornered, his dignity crushed under the weight of his own daughter's ambition. He wondered if Maria, his beloved wife, was seeing this, if she would be proud of his patience or if she would urge him to fight. The image of the children laughing in the street one day, with him leaving with a suitcase as Elisa and Marcos planned, was a ghost that haunted him. He couldn't allow it. He couldn't let his legacy, their legacy, be reduced to a mere financial asset. He knew he needed help. His pride, which had kept him silent, now bowed before the need for justice. But who to seek in Pedra Branca, a small town where everyone knew everyone and gossip traveled faster than the wind? He needed someone discreet, someone who could act with Marcos's cunning, but with the honesty Elisa had forgotten. Someone who wouldn't be swayed by appearances. Silas remembered an old friend, Pedro, who had become a lawyer in a neighboring city, an upright man who always valued the truth. He kept an old business card from Pedro with the office number. It was a chance, perhaps the only one. He picked up the landline phone, the heavy receiver in his trembling hands, and dialed the number, feeling his heart race. The voice on the other end answered. It was Pedro. Silas, for the first time in a long time, felt a glimmer of hope, but also a deep fear of what was to come. He was about to trigger the turnaround, to reveal the truth that would change everything, not just for him, but for Elisa and Marcos, and perhaps for Pedra Branca itself. That phone call was the point of no return. The phone call to Pedro was a silent confession, laden with years of hurt and wounded pride. Silas spoke in a low voice, describing the situation with concise details, but emotion spilled over in every pause. Pedro, on the other end of the line, listened with the patience only a longtime friend, now an experienced lawyer, could have. He promised to come to Pedra Branca the next morning, without fanfare, to assess the situation firsthand. Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the first breeze of hope in a long time, but the fear of confrontation still lingered, a knot in his throat he couldn't untie. The next day, Pedro arrived in a discreet car, parking a few blocks from the house. He was a middle-aged man, with graying hair and a keen gaze that radiated calm and authority. Silas greeted him on the porch, and the embrace between the two old friends was a link to the past, a reminder of simpler times. Inside, in the living room, Silas unfolded the documents on the table. Maria's will, the deed to the land on the outskirts, and the promise to purchase and sell agreement with the city hall. Pedro examined each paper carefully, his eyes scanning the clauses, the signatures, the dates. The silence in the room was dense, punctuated only by the rustling of paper and the chirping of birds outside. Pedro looked up, a gleam of surprise and admiration in his eyes. "Silas, my friend, you held a true treasure here," he said, his voice low but firm. He explained that the will, though old, was valid, guaranteeing Silas the right to live in the house until the end of his days, under the Foundation's care. But it was the contract with the City Hall that truly changed the game. That land, once forgotten, had become strategic for the city's development. The value of the promise of sale was substantial, and the confidentiality clause explained why no one, not even Elisa and Marcos, knew about the negotiation. "They think you have nothing, Silas, but you hold the future of Pedra Branca in your hands," Pedro concluded with a discreet smile. Pedro's plan was simple and direct. He would call a formal meeting, not to confront, but to clarify, to present the facts legally, with no room for doubt or manipulation. He drafted a letter, formal and concise, inviting Elisa and Marcos to a conversation in his makeshift office at a local inn, to discuss patrimonial matters related to your father's house. The letter didn't reveal the content, only the urgency. Elisa and Marcos, with the arrogance of those who feel victorious, accepted the invitation, imagining that Silas had finally given in, that the meeting would merely formalize the old man's departure. They barely knew they were walking into the biggest shock of their lives. The day of the meeting arrived with bright sunshine, a contrast to the storm that was brewing. Elisa and Marcos entered the small room at the inn with confident smiles, sitting at the table, one opposite Silas and Pedro. They greeted Pedro with forced cordiality, barely looking at Silas, who watched everything in silence. Pedro, without preamble, began to speak. "Ms. Elisa, Mr. Marcos, I was approached by Mr. Silas to assist him with some patrimonial matters. I have some documents here that I would like to share with you." He picked up Maria's will, the first piece of evidence to be fully revealed. This document, dated 20 years ago, states that the house where Mr. Silas resides will be bequeathed to a charity foundation on the condition that he can live in it until the end of his days, receiving all necessary support. Elisa's smile wavered. Marcos frowned, the calculating gleam in his eyes turning to confusion. They expected the house to be free, not tied to a foundation. But Pedro gave them no time to react. He picked up the deed to the land on the outskirts, the second piece of evidence, and placed it on the table. "And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the deed to a considerable plot of land, owned by Mr. Silas, acquired many years ago." Elisa and Marcos exchanged glances. The land on the outskirts was known to be worthless, a wasteland. What did this mean? Then, Pedro picked up the promise to purchase and sell agreement with the City Hall. This was the final blow, the fourth piece of evidence, which unmasked the premise that Silas had nothing left. He explained the negotiation, the urban expansion plan, the millions of dollars involved, the confidentiality clause that kept everything secret. The City Hall of Pedra Branca has a valid purchase and sale contract with Mr. Silas to build a school and a health center on this land. The value of the transaction is quite significant, and withdrawal would incur heavy penalties. Therefore, Mr. Silas not only has his house guaranteed, but also possesses considerable assets, which he, with due autonomy and lucidity, decided to manage according to his own wishes. The shock was visceral. Elisa's face turned pale, the color draining from it. Marcos, who had been exuding confidence, felt his jaw drop. The room fell into a deathly silence, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. The lie they had built, the image of a frail, destitute father, crumbled in an instant. They looked at each other, disbelief and anger battling in their eyes. The turnaround was complete, overwhelming. The old man who had nothing left was, in fact, the financial pillar of the city itself, and they, in their greed, had scorned a treasure they never even imagined existed. What would they do now, faced with this unquestionable truth, exposed with the coldness of the law and the authority of justice? The table, once the stage for their plans, was now the tomb of their ambitions. The shock reverberated in the room. Elisa, with wide eyes, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Marcos, his face red, seemed to fight against the reality that crushed him. This can't be true," he stammered, pointing at the papers, his voice trembling. "If this story touches something you've experienced, that feeling of having your voice ignored, of seeing your rights threatened, I invite you to subscribe to the channel now and comment on what you would do in Silas's place. Your support drives these stories, and your like helps bring this message of justice to more people. Pedro, however, remained calm, his authority unshaken. Ladies and gentlemen, the documents are clear. Donna Maria's will guarantees Mr. Silas's right to residency, and the contract with the City Hall duly registered establishes the value of the land. Your intention to vacate the house and perhaps even question your father's capacity is at the very least morally questionable and legally unsustainable. He looked at Silas, who remained silent, his posture erect, his gaze serene, a pillar of dignity. Elisa then turned to her father, a mixture of anger and despair in her eyes. "Dad, how could you do this? Hide everything from us?" she asked, her voice choked. Silas, for the first time, broke his silence. "You never asked me, Elisa. You just decided I had nothing left, that I was a burden. And the truth, my daughter, is that we only hide what we fear losing or what we need to protect." Marcos, sensing defeat, tried one last card. "But what about our share? What will we do with our plans now?" he inquired, greed still present even in the face of failure. Pedro intervened again. "Your plans, Mr. Marcos, were based on a false premise and an intention that does not align with the law or family ethics. Mr. Silas, on the other hand, secured his future and his wife's legacy. The house will remain his home, and the foundation will ensure his well-being, as expressed in the will." Elisa and Marcos understood. The game had irreversibly turned. The house, the land, the financial freedom they so coveted, all slipped away from them. What remained was shame and the consequence of their actions. They stood up, defeated, unable to look Silas in the eye. The inn door closed behind them, taking with it not only their ambitions, but also the last drop of affection that might have existed. Silas, on the other hand, took a deep breath, a soul-warming relief. Justice, after all, had found its way. The inn door closed behind them, taking with it not only their ambitions but also the last drop of affection that might have existed. Silas, on the other hand, took a deep breath, a soul-warming relief. Justice, after all, had found its way. In the days that followed, the news spread through Pedra Branca like the wind through the mango trees, not scandalously, but with the discretion of those who recognize a long-suspected truth. Silas was no longer the lonely old man, but the dignified man who had defended his legacy and his story. With the foundation's support, his modest house gained a new breath of life, and loneliness gave way to respectful and attentive company. He could see in every gesture, in every word of those around him, that his worth went far beyond any material possession. The children's laughter in the street, once a distant echo of a happiness he feared losing, was now a sweet and present sound, a reminder that life continued, full of possibilities. Elisa and Marcos, in turn, saw their plans crumble like a sandcastle. The community of Pedra Branca, once indifferent, now watched them with a mixture of disappointment and censure. They lost not only the chance of a fortune, but something much more precious: respect and trust. The idea of Silas leaving with a suitcase, which had amused them so much, now hovered over them like cruel irony. For it was they who, in a way, found themselves expelled from a dignity they never knew how to value. Silas's house, once seen as a burden, became a symbol of resilience and a legacy not measured by figures, but by principles, and a love that, even in silence, withstood the storm. And so Silas, once labeled as someone who had nothing left, proved that true wealth lies in integrity, in memory, and in the ability to protect what truly matters. He didn't just have valuable land or a well-crafted will. He had a story, an unwavering dignity, and proof that blind greed can cost much more than one can calculate. Pedra Branca's lesson was clear. A person's worth is not in what they possess, but in the character they carry and in the justice that sooner or later finds its way. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel now. Leave your comment and your like. Tell me where you're watching from so I can recognize you in the next chapters. Use the hashtag #Silas1 to show that you also believe in the power of truth. Thank you for staying until the end and supporting our channel.